Okay, we're going to run through a couple little demonstrations here. This should be easier to see than what I did on the mech in the last video. I took a piece of plastic right here. I primed up some squares. This is just a tan primer with roughly the same mid-tone purple that I'm using on the Arasaka mech. Just done in a few different squares so I can go through and kind of make a point of what I'm doing. So the first thing we're going to talk about is void blending, or what sometimes known as two brush blending. They're both the same thing, just the different names for the same technique. And essentially all you're doing, and this is where the name comes from, is putting down some paint in a shade or a highlight, putting it where you want it, a little bit thick, and then using a voided brush or cleaned brush, hence void blending, or if you have a damp second brush, hence two brush blending, to feather that paint out. Both the same thing. You don't have to use a second brush. If you do just void your brush by rinsing it out in a pot, or if you're one of those guys who likes the taste of acrylic paint, if you just want to eat it, I don't generally endorse eating paint, but hey, whatever floats your boat, man. So, what's this look like? Well, I've got over here on my palette a mix of Scale 75 Flat Black and Scale 75 Sunset Purple. So these are roughly the same shade colors that I was using on the Arasaka. Thinned down with some water, nothing fancy. So what are we going to do? We're going to get some hair on our brush, and I'm going to put it in the corner. And you can see here, it's a decent amount of paint, a little bit heavier. And you just want to lay it down actually fairly thick. And while this is still wet, rinse out your brush, dry it off, but leave it damp. And you can see here, this will get wet as I move it slowly in to where I have that wet paint. And you want to grab it, and once you have it, feather it out. So basically what you're doing is just using the water to establish a gradient. Now if you don't like it, you can always go back in, grab a little bit more of the paint, feather it out a little bit more. You have quite a bit of time to do this, especially if you're working with your paint as thin as it's supposed to be. You can do it with another color, right? So if you don't want it to be this dark, you could go back in, you could add a little bit of mid-tone, same thing, clean out your brush, go back in with a damp, feather it in. As long as you keep this paint wet, you can do this as long as you want. And then you just take that shade color and feather it out. Sweep it back and forth. As you draw down, your brush will get clean. You can also clean your brush out more, go back in, feather out a little bit more. Now this won't give you the smoothest blend on the first try, but it will give you a pretty good one. Let's go ahead and try it again here. A little bit heavier, a little bit more. Not used to doing this on something this large. So that's a pretty big corner you've got there. Get the brush, clean it out, damp, feather it in until you hit that paint. And you'll see the edge start to soften when you've got it. And that's when you just want to grab it, sweep the brush back and forth over the area you want to feather it into. Don't be afraid to go back in there, grab a little bit more, sweep it out again. And it's hard to see because it's wet, but once this dries, you'll have a fairly smooth gradient. You can repeat this as necessary. If you don't want to do it too heavy at once, we can do the same thing. I'll just grab a little of that Sunset Purple, this time without the black. Thin it down a little bit with some water. Same basic technique. We're just going to turn this 90 degrees. I'm going to drop some of that Sunset Purple right here. You can see that is darker than the purple we have. It's a little bit more saturated with red than the neutral tone. It's a little bit more violet. Take that damp brush, work your way into that Sunset Purple, grab it, pull it down, feather it out. You repeat this as necessary, and you'll get a good gradient. Again, it's hard to see when it's wet because it's still shiny. You can obviously see that in there. There's still quite a bit of shine. I keep a hairdryer next to where I paint. Uh, you can also just blow on it if you have an airbrush. Don't put the paint through it. You can just use your airbrush to speed this along and dry it. So that's void blending, two-brush blending. It's really simple. Once it's dry, you can repeat as necessary. On the Arisaka, I have probably hit it 3 or 4 times in most of the shade areas with a little more gradual steps, building up a medium tone over a bigger area, and then a darker tone over a smaller area, and almost black into the smallest area, just to reinforce the gradient. Again, you can always build up. It's a lot easier to continue to add paint to something than it is to take things away. So this works really well with dark colors and colors that are transparent. Where you're going to run into trouble with this, you can do it, but it's not particularly friendly to paints, especially whites, because the pigment is so opaque. So if you try to feather out a white, a lot of times you'll end up with a cloudy look, and you'll still get a relatively strong division between where your feathering ends and the medium tone. I've got some Watercolors Violet 1, which is one of the highlight colors that I have been using on the Arisaka. Also a little bit of just good old pure white. Also from the Watercolors line. And you'll notice I use a lot of Watercolors in Scale 75. One of the reasons I do this is the acrylic medium they have is a gel. It stays workable much longer. Since this is a blending technique that I use a lot of, having a longer working time is generally just better. I favor paints like this. It doesn't mean they're better per se. They're just better for how I paint. I strongly encourage everybody when they're painting, experiment around with a bunch of different brands. Find what works for you. Different painting styles, different brands are going to be better for specific kinds of painting. For me, Watercolors and Scale 75, kind of hard to beat. So, back to what I was talking about. If I grab a 50-50 mix here of that Violet 1 and white, and we go down here to this guy, we can take that and we can put some of that in the corner too. Same basic concept, right? We're just loading up a corner with it. We're voiding out our brush. Take the damp brush, moisten the surface, and then just slowly work your way into that paint. And then slowly feather it back out. Now, again, this is not a particularly friendly technique to lighter paints, especially towards white, because you end up with very opaque pigment. Again, it's difficult to see because of the wetness, but you can see there is a gradient there. It's just not particularly clean. What you can do, another technique that I like, is called loaded brush. Kind of made famous by Ben Komitz. Really fantastic painter. If you've never seen anything he's done, I suggest you go look him up. He's got some of his own videos on YouTube. There's now a defunct channel called Painting Buddha, where he had done a lot of tutorials. Amazing guy, one of the best miniature painters in the world. How loaded brush works. You're going to take your mid-tone, so the same purple, and I have my brush here. You can see there is a decent amount on here. And what you want to do is, once you've got your brush loaded up, and you want to thin it down a little bit more, so I'm going to add a little bit more water. You don't want your brush drenched, but you want a decent amount of your mid-tone in there. And then you take the very tip of the brush and you add some pure white. So you can see there's some pure white on there. And what you do, you go to where you want your highlight, you put the white down, and then as you feather out, you slowly increase the pressure. And what you're doing is essentially wet blending with the brush as you paint. Pretty straightforward stuff. It gives you a really nice gradient. It's super simple. It's really fast. So it gives you a good blend without doing too terribly much work. It can be a little tricky at first getting down the consistency of the paint in the belly of the brush, your mid-tone, and how much white to use, how much pressure to use, a little bit of practice. This kind of thing is actually really good, is if you can grab a card like this. It can give you a big surface to paint on, that way you're not trying to fight with a miniature and get into a little crevice. But you can see here, because this is actually drying out pretty quick, there's a pretty solid gradient there. Real simple stuff. So that's the two primary methods of blending, and then as usual, once you've got these gradients down, you can go back in with your mid-tone and some glaze medium, or even just thin it down very thin, glaze over the whole thing. What that will do is take the dark areas and shift them back more towards your mid-tone. It'll take the highlight areas, again, move them back down towards your mid-tone, and it smooths the blend and kind of ties all the colors together. It's a good way to smooth out blends. It's a good way to unify colors. It also helps you correct things like reds or even purples, where when you highlight, the highlight color tends to go pastel. That's one of the common pitfalls a lot of people run into with red. As you start to highlight, the highlight color either will turn a pink, maybe an orange, maybe even a yellow, but it's very difficult to keep it red. If you let it go to that high yellow or orange or pink, you can do that. You can just go real bright. You can go to almost pure white. And then when you're done, you glaze over the whole thing with your mid-tone red. It will shift the whole thing down, and you'll end up with much more intense red highlights that will stay red. So you get away from that kind of pastel look that you tend to go to with things like pink for a purple or orange for a red. Just a handy tip. Blending like this, it's not as hard as people make it out to be. It can be a little intimidating at first, but now that this is dry, you can see there's a actually fairly smooth gradient there. That's probably a better angle. You can see this here. Again, you do that a couple times, it'll be even smoother. Same thing up here. You can see this is where just was the purple, and it's just feathered out. You can go back in, repeat as necessary, get it as dark as you want, get it out as far as you want, get the smoothness where you want. Easy peasy. This is super simple. Anybody can do it. Not terribly complicated. Just takes a little bit of practice. So hopefully you found this useful. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a message, post down below, reply to the post on YouTube. Happy to talk about this stuff. Thanks, guys.